Hello and welcome back to Geopolitics Worldwide. For over 4 decades, Australia has been one of the wealthiest countries globally. Thanks to its economic prosperity, friendly locals, and pleasant climate, the country is often portrayed as an ideal destination. However, the past decade has seen a decline in living standards. What seemed like an economic recovery post-COVID-19 has turned sour, with Australia entering a per capita recession, marking only the second such event since 1991. Despite wages rising, inflation has grown faster, making goods and services more expensive. As a result, the purchasing power of Australians has declined, and inflation-adjusted wages have been falling for the past 3 years. Though the rate of decline has slowed, real wages remain at the same level as in 2009. This loss of progress in living standards has cost the Australians tens of thousands of dollars, making the cost of living a central issue for many. Australia faces one of the worst economic cost of living squeezes in its history. Australia shares a colonial history with the United Kingdom, and the two countries also face many similar challenges, including falling wages, declining living standards, and a critical housing crisis. Housing affordability has become a significant problem, with Sydney ranking as the second most unaffordable city globally. Melbourne and Adelaide also rank among the top 10 most unaffordable cities, with Perth and Brisbane not far behind. For many Australians, especially first-time homebuyers, owning a house is increasingly out of reach. Even more troubling is the forecast that by 2028, real wages will remain at the same level they were in 2014, unless economic growth accelerates. The gap in living standards could persist into the 2030s. Ironically, hundreds of thousands of people continue to migrate to Australia each year in search of a better life, contributing to the housing demand. While Australia remains a beautiful country, the economic realities are grim for many residents. In recent years, immigration has become a contentious issue in Australian media. Some argue that it worsens the housing crisis, while others point out that the issue is far more complex. Nevertheless, Australia continues to face a severe shortage of affordable housing. Historically, Australia has been a prosperous country, with a strong economy dating back to the European settlement in the late 18th century. By the late 1800s, Australian incomes were 40% higher than those in the United States. The 20th century brought economic boom periods in the 1950s, 60s, and 90s, largely driven by resource extraction, particularly iron, coal, and natural gas. The widespread extraction of iron ore began in the 1950s and 60s, when a lift on export bans attracted private companies to Australia. These companies exported resources to industrializing nations like Japan, which required iron ore for steel production. This resource boom created thousands of jobs and spurred infrastructure development, such as the construction of railroads connecting remote regions to the coast. Revenue from mining also enabled Australia to invest in education and transition toward a service-based economy. By the 2000s, Australia had a highly skilled workforce and was well positioned to benefit from China's rapid economic growth. Australia's exports of iron ore to China surged, providing a buffer against the 2008 global financial crisis. Despite these strengths, Australia now grapples with several deep-rooted economic issues, including rising inequality, stagnant wages, and persisting housing crisis. These challenges stem from policy decisions made over the years and need urgent attention to ensure a sustainable future. The housing crisis in particular is a major concern for Australians. There are simply not enough homes to meet demand, making homeownership increasingly unattainable for average families. For instance, to purchase an average home in Sydney, a family would need an annual income of approximately $208,000, while the average income in the city is around $120,000. This disparity illustrates why many Australians struggle to afford homes. Australia's housing supply is well below the OECD average, with only 420 homes per 1,000 people. This shortage is exacerbated by the increasing proportion of household income required to buy or rent a home. On average, Australians now need to save for 11 years just to afford a deposit on a home. The number of homes available for sale has declined since 2015, and the rental market has been shrinking since 2020. In 2023, only 170,000 homes were completed, the lowest number in a decade. This trend has been developing for over 20 years, with home building rates steadily declining since the 1960s. Part of the housing crisis is tied to Australian culture, which places a high value on suburban living and ample space. This preference for suburban homes over urbanization results in fewer people living in densely populated areas. For example, Sydney and Melbourne are 3 times less densely populated than London and 10 times less than Paris. The desire for suburban space, combined with government bureaucracy, makes obtaining planning permissions for new housing developments difficult and time-consuming. Ironically, Australia has vast amounts of land, yet the price of land and homes continue to rise. Immigration is often cited as a contributing factor to the housing crisis, as around 720,000 people migrated to Australia in 2023, the highest number in a decade. While more people increase demand for housing, most immigrants are on temporary visas and primarily impact the rental market. Over time, immigration levels have actually fallen, meaning it's not the sole cause of rising house prices. Another factor exacerbating the economic situation is stagnant wages. When adjusted for inflation, Australian wages have not increased since 2009. This wage stagnation is closely linked to weak productivity growth, a crucial driver for economic growth. Productivity in Australia has been weak for 2 decades, falling short of precious levels. In 2022, productivity declined by about 4%, with output failing to keep pace with the 6.9% increase in hours worked. Essentially, Australians have been working more hours but producing less. One way to improve productivity is by investing in research and development (R&D), which drives innovation. However, Australia's R&D spending is significantly lower than that of other OECD countries and developed nations like the United States and the United Kingdom. The lack of productivity growth burdens average Australians, who see stagnant wages while the cost of living continues to rise. Declining productivity has also worsened inequality in Australia. While income inequality is relatively low compared to other countries, wealth inequality paints a different picture. Nearly half of all Australians' wealth is held by the top 10% of households, with each household averaging $5.2 million in wealth. This group holds 15 times the wealth of the lowest 60% of households. The growing gap between asset owners and non-owners exacerbates inequality, especially as housing prices rise far faster than incomes. A report from Australia's Institute revealed that 93% of the economic gains in the past decade went to the top 10% of households, while the remaining 90% of Australians saw only 7% of the benefit. This growing inequality is a major concern, as it slows growth. Wealthier individuals tend to invest in financial markets and real estate rather than spending on goods and services that drive economic activity. Meanwhile, lower-income Australians struggle to afford essentials like education, limiting their opportunities for upward mobility. Although wealth inequality in Australia is lower than in countries like the United States and the United Kingdom, it continues to worsen each year. As the gap widens, there is a growing sense of discontent among the majority of Australians who feel left behind. Addressing these issues requires urgent action from the government, but housing affordability and wage stagnation have been neglected for decades. These problems need bipartisan cooperation and a long-term strategy, yet there's been little progress. Without significant changes, Australia's economic struggles, including its housing crisis and widening inequality, are likely to persist for many years.